Before we get started on our event, I just would like to point out this program is part of KEI's academic paper series, which means our featured speaker has also written a paper to correspond with her talk today. I'm sure her forthcoming remarks will cover many of the key points in her paper, but to get all the details, I would highly encourage you to check it out on our website. You can find it on keia.org. I'd also like to note that we are now accepting paper proposals for our 2021 academic paper series through December 4th. I'm a bit biased here, but it's truly a great way to get your research seen by a wide audience. And the series covers an equally wide array of topics related to Korea, which you can also find more information about on our website, keia.org. While I oversee the series, one of the other hats that I wear at KEI is managing our university outreach efforts. Before the pandemic, I had the pleasure of traveling all around the US, talking with students about the importance of the U.S.-Korea relationship. Though I've been to many different schools, one thing I can always count on is either seeing Korean students or engaging with university administrators who are interested in enrolling more Korean students, trying to get more potential Korean students to come to their universities. We're now conducting these university outreach programs virtually, so if there are any university professors or administrators listening in, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards if you're interested. But my point here is that Korean students are an important and almost seemingly ubiquitous part of the U.S. higher education system. But our speaker today points out that why we shouldn't be taking this enrollment for granted and why declining numbers of South Korean students in the U.S. higher education system have been going down even before 2017 and the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm so glad to say that we're joined today by Dr. Stephanie Kim, an assistant professor of practice in Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies and the faculty director of Georgetown's Master in Higher Education Administration. Outside of Georgetown, she serves as an associate editor of the Journal of International Students and is the vice president of the Fulbright Association National Capital Area Chapter. She holds a PhD in education from the University of California, Los Angeles. Stephanie will present for about 30 minutes or so, and we'll use the remainder of the time, remainder of the hour, for questions. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window, and please feel free to start sending in your questions at any point during the presentation. And with that, I'll now turn things over to Stephanie.
Great. Well, thank you, Kyle, and your team for all your coordination and getting this talk set up, and also for editing the paper that accompanies it. Thank you to the Korea Economic Institute for hosting me this afternoon. It's too bad that we couldn't do this in person, but I think this virtual format actually allows for a lot more people to join. And of course, thank you to everyone out there joining my talk this afternoon. These days there are so many different virtual events that are all competing for our attention. And so thank you for taking the time to join this one. So I am just going to share my screen, then we'll get started. There we go. And thumbs up if you can see it. Okay, great. Thank you. So my talk today is based on the research that I've been doing for about the last decade. I research and write about higher education reform, and much of my work has focused on internationalization reforms in South Korea and the United States. And so I approach this question, why are fewer South Koreans studying in the United States, as first and foremost a scholar of higher education, while also recognizing the important policy implications that the answer to that question has. And so let's get started. First, I just want to give a broad overview of international higher education in the United States. As I'm sure most people attending this session are aware, international students are big moneymakers, both for the U.S. higher education sector and beyond. NAFSA, which is the largest U.S.-based professional association for international educators, calculates that as of the 2018 to 19 academic year, international students contributed $41 billion to the U.S. economy and supported more than 458,000 jobs. And as I'm sure most people attending the session are also aware, the largest contributors of international students to the United States are China and India. And in fact, enrollment by students from China and India constitute more than half of all international student enrollment in the US higher education sector. But a lot has changed in the last several years. The 2016 US presidential election certainly marks a clear rupture in the international higher education landscape. Since 2016, campus leaders across the US higher education sector have feared that Trump's America First rhetoric discourages international students from coming to American campuses. And rightly so. In fact, when we look at new international student enrollment in US higher education, these are new students entering degree programs for the first time. We see a notable decline starting in the 2016 to 17 academic year onwards. So this is data published by the Institute of International Education through their annual Open Doors report. And if you look at the numbers presented here, even in the years following the Great Recession, new enrollment still continued to grow. And it really wasn't until 2016 that we see an actual drop in new enrollment numbers. And that was the first time that that number dropped in 12 years. It dropped by 3.3% in 2016, followed by 6.6% in 2017, and then 0.9% in 2018. And just in a few weeks from now, IIE will release its latest Open Doors report. And at that time, we'll be able to see what the numbers for 2019 look like. And of course, it goes without saying that numbers for 2020 are very likely going to be considerably lower. But we can talk more extensively about COVID-19 in the Q&A. So pundits have seized upon this particular trend and have pointed to the Trump effect as the reason behind the decline in new international student enrollment in the United States. These headlines here are just a small sample of ones that have appeared pretty much since Trump took office. And they've continued pretty much every year thereafter, especially every fall, right after the annual Open Doors is released. You tend to see a big flurry of these kinds of headlines. And so today, the narrative is that the Trump effect is to blame for recent declines in new international student enrollment. And this is the narrative that's widely accepted across the US higher education sector and beyond. Now, campus leaders have responded to this with a number of different strategies. And the most notable is the You Are Welcome Here campaign. This started out as a social media campaign by US colleges and universities to signal to international students that their campuses are still welcoming places. And it's now evolved and become a scholarship program for international students that's administered by NAFSA. Now, while these concerns about the Trump effect are certainly valid, and my intent is not to dismiss very, very real issues of racism and xenophobia, I do want to highlight some important points that don't fit neatly into the narrative that the Trump effect is entirely to blame for falling international student enrollments. And that starts with enrollment by students from South Korea. As you can see here, South Korea is the third largest contributor of international students to US higher education as of the 2018 to 19 academic year, which is where this data is pulled from. There were over 52,000 South Korean students enrolled in US colleges and universities. And it's important to mention that not only is South Korea currently the third largest contributor of international students, it has consistently been so for the last 2 decades. It's been surpassed only by China and India, which is actually, frankly, amazing, considering that both China and India have a population that dwarfs South Korea. So if you actually adjust for population, South Korea sends 3 times more students than China does and 6 times more students than India does. South Korea is and has been one of the largest, if not at times the largest per capita contributor of international students to the United States consistently over the last 2 decades. But despite South Korea's important role in the US higher education sector, The number of South Koreans studying at American campuses has been steadily declining for roughly the last decade. The number, as you can see here, peaked at just over 75,000 students in the 2008 to 09 academic year, but that number has been gradually declining since. And a decade later, as of the 2018 to 19 academic year, we actually see a 30% decline from its peak. And of course, this decline began well before the more recent general declines in new international student enrollment. I also want to show enrollment trends of South Korean students in intensive English programs. Intensive English programs are specialized language programs that are attached to American campuses that enroll international students for full-time English language study. And I show this information because intensive English programs are actually much more sensitive to enrollment fluctuations, and so they often serve as a bellwether for what we can expect to happen in degree programs just a few years down the road, in some cases just a few semesters down the road. So as you can see here in the chart, the number of South Koreans enrolled in intensive English programs peaked at just over 13,000 students in 2008. And I should mention that South Korea was actually the largest sender of students to intensive English programs for most of the mid-2000s, actually surpassing even students from China. But that number has dramatically declined since then. In the most recent data as of 2019, the number of students has declined from its peak by a breathtaking 60%. So why are fewer South Koreans studying in the United States? What are the underlying causes of this concerning trend? And what are the implications for the United States when such a major contributor of international students wanes? Before I get into answering this question, I just want to say that Americans have a tendency to center the United States in world affairs, and I say that as an American. This is especially true in the U.S. higher education sector, which is why we've pointed to the Trump effect to explain decreases in international student enrollments. But as we can see from the data, that's not exactly what's going on with South Korean students. And so to answer that question, I encourage those of us, especially who are based in the United States, to go beyond our American myopia and to examine what's actually happening within South Korea. So just to give some general context to what I'll talk about in a moment, South Korea is often heralded for its rapid economic advancements alongside its rapid advances in educational attainment. Today, South Korea has the most educated youth population in the world. Over 70% of the country's 25 to 34-year-olds have completed higher education. That's the highest number. And just for comparison, the U.S., 50% of 25 to 34-year-olds have completed higher education. But South Korea is also a case study of educational extremes. The country's high-pressure culture around education has created a very expensive and predatory shadow education market of cram schools and private tutors and even early study abroad. I mean, it's no coincidence that this TV show, Sky Castle, was the most popular drama in South Korea last year. And it's this high cost of educating children that's often blamed for the country's incredibly low birth rate because it adds significant non-formal education costs to raising children. Since the early 80s, South Korea's fertility rate fell below that of the population replacement level. And actually, today, South Korea has the lowest fertility rate in the world, averaging less than one birth per woman. And so these extreme demographic trends are part and parcel of South Korea's education culture, and they've had a substantial effect on higher education in South Korea. Specifically, they've affected the number of domestic students who are enrolling into South Korean higher education institutions, primarily because of the falling fertility rate. So as you can see here, for the last 2 decades, South Korean schools have seen a plateauing and then a decreasing number of new incoming students. In the year 2000, there were over 819,000 new students entering higher education institutions. But most recently, as of 2019, that number has dropped by 22%. And these numbers actually reflect the national average. If you look at schools located in the provincial areas outside of the Seoul metropolitan region, you'll actually see a much more acute student shortage, and many have actually closed or merged with other schools due to financial pressures. So, as a direct response to the domestic student shortage, the South Korean government introduced a series of policies throughout the 2000s and the 2010s intended to internationalize the country's higher education sector in order to attract more international students and make up for domestic student shortfalls. The first internationalization policy was called the Study Korea Project. It launched in 2004. It still runs today. And this project actively targets international student enrollment through the special scholarships, and it improves support services for international students who come to South Korean campuses. One direct result of this policy was the spectacular growth in English-mediated instruction across South Korean universities. I'm sure those of you who have spent time in South Korean universities will be well familiar with this, but top universities that benefited the most from increased international student enrollment began to offer a larger proportion of their classes in English in order to accommodate these diverse student populations. So today, top private universities like Yonsei University and Korea University offer a third of their classes in English, and notable STEM universities like POSTECH and KAIST offer nearly all of their classes in English. The second policy was the Brain Korea 21 project, which was in place from 1999 to 2012. And the objective of this policy was to internationalize the research capacity of South Korean universities. And the goal was to nurture at least 10 universities to world-class status. The project measured success primarily by quantifying the number of publications that faculty would produce in index journals. And this project focused primarily on global university rankings as proof of institutional performance. Now, there are a number of reforms that this particular policy has resulted in, but one very specific cumulative effect of both the Study Korea and the Brain Korea 21 projects is a hiring preference across South Korean universities for faculty with advanced English language capabilities. So for the last 2 decades, universities have begun to require that newly hired professors teach at least some, if not all, of their classes in English, and measure faculty productivity by the number of publications in English language journals. And this has effectively institutionalized a hiring incentive for faculty who have received their terminal degrees from institutions in English-speaking countries, in most cases the United States. And actually, if you do a quick skim of the faculty across the universities that have benefited the most from these special projects, from the special funding that they get, namely the top universities such as the Sky universities and others, you'll notice that many of the faculty have received their PhDs from U.S. universities. The third policy was the World Class University Project, which operated from 2008 to 2013. It was essentially a higher education subsidy program that invited overseas scholars to South Korean universities as a way of importing foreign talent on a large and systematic scale. And so under the auspices of this program, foreign scholars were invited to establish new academic programs, especially in the STEM fields, and they were also recruited as full-time professors in existing programs. And as you can see here, in the 5 or so years that the project ran, the number of full-time foreign faculty working across South Korean higher education approximately doubled between 2008 to 2013. Now, the last internationalization policy was the Brain Korea 21 Plus project, which operated from 2013 to 2019. And the goal of this project was to strengthen graduate education in South Korean universities Early evaluations of this project indicate that it has indeed increased graduate students' academic performance and research output. So the ultimate goal of all of these policies combined was to improve the quality of South Korean universities so that they could attract more international students. And on that front, they have been successful, as we can see from the impressive growth in international student enrollment in South Korea. So if you look here in the year 2000, there were just under 4,000 international students. But by 2019, there were over 100,000 international students. And just to clarify, these are the numbers for degree-seeking students in higher education institutions. If we actually count students who enroll in language and other non-credit programs, that number is actually much greater. And I'll say that the majority of international students in South Korea come from China and increasingly Vietnam. But the number of international students in South Korea is really just a drop in the bucket when we put it into context with broader enrollment across South Korean higher education. International students constitute only 3% of total enrollment. Nonetheless, internationalization reforms have had an outsized influence on South Korean universities. We've seen the explosion of English-mediated instruction, a codified hiring preference for faculty who can teach and research in English and also hold U.S. university degrees, the influx of full-time foreign faculty, and as a result, South Korean universities have become distinctly international campus settings that supposedly cater to international students. But what purpose do they actually serve if international students only account for 3% of total enrollment? And the answer to that lies within the decreasing number of South Korean students studying abroad more generally. Alongside the increase in international student inflow, we've also seen the decrease in domestic student outflow. The number of South Korean students studying abroad peaked in 2011 and has pretty much been steadily declining since. And this is not just a coincidence. What it means is that internationalization reforms in the South Korean higher education sector don't just function to attract international students to South Korea, they also effectively function to retain South Koreans who may otherwise study abroad, particularly for students who are bound for the United States. When you have the proliferation of English-mediated instruction, internationalized curricula, internationally trained domestic faculty, and even foreign faculty, South Korean universities are very international campus settings, but they also cater to South Korean students who seek those kinds of opportunities. And so just as an example, I mentioned KAIST earlier about KAIST offering most of its classes in English. Well, KAIST offers 80% of its classes in English, but international students actually account for less than 10% of its enrollment. And in effect, the university has created an English language learning environment for primarily South Korean students. And even campus settings that are explicitly designed for international students, so the specialized international colleges that are housed inside a South Korean university. I've done a lot of research in this area. Even these specialized colleges still enroll a majority South Korean student body. But because all of these different kinds of campus settings have implemented reforms that follow international or quote unquote American standards, they also effectively offer domestic alternatives to studying abroad for South Korean students who seek out that learning experience without having to go very far from home. And this is what I call reverse student mobility, that internationalization reforms in ascending countries' higher education sector actually have a more substantial effect on the reversal of domestic student outflow than they do on the increase in international student inflow. And this is what has contributed significantly to the declining number of South Korean students in the United States. So what does this mean for the United States? Well, as longtime allies, the United States and South Korea rely on strong people-to-people connections fostered through things like cross-border education. But with the reduction of students from a major sender of students to the U.S. higher education sector, the United States is is in less of a position to win the hearts and minds of people from a country of strategic geopolitical importance. And the continuing decline of South Korean students studying in the United States may be an early indicator of shifting priorities among South Korean youth that maybe could foretell shifting geopolitical alliances in the near future. So, for example, the number of South Korean students studying in China has actually been steadily increasing in recent years, even though the overall number of South Korean students going abroad has been declining. As of 2018, there were over 50,000 South Koreans studying in China. Most were actually there for language study, not degree programs. But nonetheless, South Korea and China mutually send the largest number of international students to each other's respective higher education sectors. And this points to an emerging bilateral relationship between the two countries. And also, I often get a question when I give talks is, so why should we care? Why should we care about this particular phenomenon related to South Korea? I think it's just a very particular question that only Korean studies specialists get compared to perhaps other East Asianists. But I will say that the trends that we see from South Korean students can also serve as an early warning for trends that we might see from other major senders of international students to the United States, such as China. On all possible measures of related to education, South Korea stands out as an extreme outlier. And for this reason, what happens in South Korea often soon follows in other parts of Asia and elsewhere. The intense fever for English education, the burgeoning of the private education market, the explosion of early study abroad, and the incredible growth of international students in the US higher education sector are all things that happened in South Korea first, followed by other places such as China. And so similar to the declines that we've seen from South Korean students coming to the United States, we're actually now starting to see the plateauing of Chinese students coming to the United States. And personally, I would guess that actual declines are probably not too far down the road. And this shift might be related to the Trump effect and our current political environment, but it more likely has to do with the fact that internationalization reforms are also being aggressively adopted in the Chinese higher education sector that effectively offered Chinese students international education opportunities at home. But I will say that the United States is still the preferred destination for degree-seeking students from South Korea. And so there are a number of measures that US policymakers can take to ensure that this continues and to address this phenomenon of reverse student mobility. First, US policymakers should create and expand programs that promote the unique strengths of the US higher education system so that the US higher education sector can meet South Korean students' evolving needs. With international education opportunities at home to choose from, South Korean students are much more cost conscious about studying abroad. And this is especially so when the US dollar is strong relative to the South Korean won, because it's not just the difference in tuition, but also the currency exchange rates that make studying abroad more expensive. But many students are not as familiar with the broad range and diversity of institution types and degree programs in the United States, or the differentiated application requirements and costs associated with them. So for example, community colleges in the United States can offer a less expensive study abroad pathway for international students as they do for domestic students, often without the burden of test scores, while also opening up transfer possibilities into four-year schools. And so highlighting these things, the range and the diversity of the US higher education sector, perhaps through targeted promotion campaigns in conjunction with organizations like Education USA. I was just at the virtual forum that's happening this week. All of these things will ensure that the South Korean students have the right information to make informed decisions about studying abroad in the United States. And also these promotion campaigns should not just serve students only, but also parents and high school guidance counselors who are often just as influential in the college selection process. Policymakers should also recognize the importance of strengthening the US student visa system. So specifically, it's essential that the optional practical training visa, the OPT visa, which allows a temporary employment period after a student graduates from a degree program, a US degree program, to legally work in the United States. It's essential that this visa remains a viable option for international students. New students from South Korea seek out value-add options that combine education and work experience, particularly at the graduate level. And the OPT visa encourages more South Korean students to come to the United States because it allows those students to return home, not just with a US university degree, but also with coveted work experience in the United States, which gives those students a competitive edge upon returning home in a job market that's actually quite saturated with US university degree holders. And this visa is vital for ensuring that the United States continues to be an attractive destination for degree-seeking students from South Korea and beyond. And last but not least, US policymakers should also prioritize the importance of South Korea as a study abroad destination for American students. These two-way flows are vital for strengthening people-to-people ties and further encourages incoming student mobility from South Korea. This means creating and expanding programs that encourage American students to go abroad beyond conventionally popular destinations in Western Europe to learn Korean language and culture. Prestigious scholarship programs like the Fulbright program, the Boren Awards, they do that, as does Title VI of the Higher Education Act, of course, but additional programs that encourage a wider population of American students to study in South Korea are also necessary. So, for example, we might create targeted scholarship programs that fund underrepresented minority students to study in South Korea and perhaps other destinations of strategic importance to US foreign policy. And I will also say that the fastest growing population across American campuses is actually non-traditional students, so those who work full-time and attend school part-time. And so programs must also meet those students' particular needs. And this means that Pell Grants and other federal aid programs should be able to fund summer and short-term study abroad, in addition to semester and year-long programs. And so to conclude, the Trump effect may have dampened international student enrollment in the United States, but South Korea paints a more complicated picture. The South Korean higher education sector has adopted aggressive internationalization reforms, and this has unexpectedly begun to reverse the flow of South Korean students headed to the United States. And of course, we don't know yet the full impact that COVID-19 will have, but I suspect that reverse student mobility will be profoundly magnified as conditions for going abroad become much more difficult. But there is a lot that US policymakers can do to address reverse student mobility. To do this, however, policymakers must acknowledge the strategic importance of South Korea as a major contributor of international students to the US higher education sector, as an essential component to US foreign policy that has broader geopolitical implications. And the work that policymakers do can ensure that the strong bilateral relationship continues and through these vital people-to-people connections. So thank you very much. I guess we'll be moving into Q&A after this, but I also encourage you to connect over email. You can also find me on Twitter. My contact information is right there on the screen. So thank you.
No, it's us who have to thank you. That was a great presentation, really great analysis. I know we had posted this on social media and everyone was talking about the Trump effect, but as you point out, it goes a lot deeper than that. And I can't really argue with your recommendations, both fellow Fulbright alumnus. I think it's really important to encourage those two-way flows. It's not just about getting Koreans to come here, but also getting Americans to go there. And I can't agree with you more about sending more non-traditional students to Korea. I think it really helps to emphasize to Korea just the breadth and the depth of who the American people are. And we can't talk about everything we've just gone through, and obviously you mentioned this in your discussion as well, without also mentioning COVID-19. And I'm sure there'll be a lot more questions about this as we get the Q&A started. But let me just sort of get the ball rolling here, and we could jump topics a little bit too, but on COVID, um, it's still early yet, but do you have a sense of how changes taken to adapt to the pandemic could have an impact on the number of international students in the U.S. more broadly, and South Korean students more specifically once the pandemic is over?
Yeah, I'll answer that tentatively because I don't have a crystal ball. I think if I did, it would be a very different. If anyone did, the situation would be very different. But um, I'll say this: there are two things that I think are likely to happen. The first is what I had mentioned briefly earlier, was that reverse student mobility potentially could be profoundly magnified. It's more difficult to go abroad, and so you are going to look at alternative opportunities at home. So whether that's in South Korea, whether that's in other countries. And with that being said, there might also be more intra-regional mobility. So, for example, South Koreans who go to China, Chinese students who go to South Korea, that might play a major role as travel restrictions start to ease up. But the other point I would say is that there will always be a group of South Koreans who are going to still want an education in the United States. But we run the risk of stratification, and especially if you so if you think about the students coming to the United States much more recently, I mean, these are students whose test scores are, the average has test scores at the highest levels, the GPAs are at the highest levels, are graduating from the most elite high schools. They are the 1% of South Korea, oftentimes, not exclusively. And so we run this risk of increased stratification of who gets to study abroad and benefit from a U.S. higher education. And I think this is where it's so important to really strengthen and promote the diversity of the U.S. higher education sector so that it can meet a diversity of students' needs.
COVID has made it really difficult to predict, the next few days, let alone what things look like after it's over. But I know a lot of people are interested in sort of getting those long-term trends. So I thank you for even tentatively providing that answer. Switching gears a little bit, we talked about extrapolating what this could potentially mean for the broader relationships, and I just wanted to get into that a little bit more and ask, how much can we really extrapolate the overall numbers of Korean students in China versus the United States, especially considering that Korean students are primarily in China for language and not necessarily for higher education degree studies. Now, you mentioned that it's in the past, it's sort of been a bellwether, language education translating into that's where students will go for a higher education degree. And the numbers in the paper, you have this more specifically. You say the numbers of number of Korean students studying in China for language study relative to especially relative to what's going on to the amount of language study the Korean students are doing in the United States. The number of Chinese students studying Korean students studying Chinese language in China is going up. The fact that there is more of an emphasis on Chinese language is it possible to say that it could be more reflective of where the Chinese see economic opportunities going, and not necessarily reflective of changing geopolitical strategies, alliances, things along those lines, especially because the Chinese system and the American system have very different education values and have very different values more broadly. And the fact that we're not seeing necessarily South Korean students studying more in the Chinese education system because it's a bit more, maybe because it's a bit more restrictive. Could that sort of provide some limitations on how much we can extrapolate this to the broader relationship?
Sure. I think you make an absolutely valid point that perhaps this increase in Korean students studying in China for Chinese language study could potentially evolve into more South Korean students pursuing degree programs in China. especially in parallel to what I had mentioned about intensive English programs. I will say, though, that still the majority of degree-seeking students who go abroad out from South Korea, about half still choose the United States, and that's the largest group of degree-seeking students who study abroad. And I will say that also English language education in South Korea is not going anywhere. Certainly, there may be the popularity of third languages like Chinese, for example. But nonetheless, I think that it's given the particular history of the South Korean university system, I think that there's a very strong American influence in it, and for that reason, there are these naturally strong connections between South Korea and the U.S., particularly at the higher education level. And so, I think this is what U.S. policymakers could really benefit from. That at the degree-seeking student population, that it is U.S. university degrees that are very much desired still.
Thank you for that insightful answer. I'll turn things over now to the number of questions that we've gotten from the audience. Mr. Lou Berens asks, are South Korean students still internationally mobile despite population declines in the pull towards China? If they're increasingly not going to the US, are they going elsewhere besides China? And is there any distinction between the undergraduate and graduate level?
Yeah, good question. So there are probably two parts to that. Yes, there are population declines. And so also part of the reason why we see South Korean students in the United States is also there are just fewer South Koreans. But we can see that the fertility rate has perhaps less of a factor than other more push-pull factors related to the attractiveness of degree options, the affordability of degree options. In terms of South Korean students studying in the United States, and in general, international students in the United States, there was actually more of an emphasis on graduate education in the earlier years of international student mobility. So in the early 2000s, we actually saw a greater number of graduate students specifically. So students who would pursue their undergraduate studies in their home country, but pursue graduate education, particularly at the doctoral level. And so probably about mid-late 2000s onwards, we actually see a shift in much more of a focus on undergraduate international student recruitment. And so we've actually seen more undergraduate students from South Korea study abroad as opposed to at the graduate level. And this is also reflected not just in higher education, but even at the early study abroad level. Early study abroad used to be something that a student would do during high school, but increasingly has been characterized by an even earlier study abroad period at middle school and sometimes even elementary school. So there is a shift in the undergraduate study abroad experience that we've seen here in the United States.
Next question comes from a former colleague, Jenna Gibson. She asks, can you talk a bit more about schools in Korea providing classes in English and international institutions opening Korean campuses and how they balance the ostensible goal of attracting international students with what you mentioned about attracting domestic students who want to get more of an international education close to home, so these dual objectives there?
Yeah. So I'm going to interpret that question to mean what is the role of specifically international branch campuses in South Korea? And forgive me if I've interpreted the question incorrectly. And so, yes, that is a great point. So what is the role of these oftentimes American, though not exclusively, international branch campuses that set up shop in South Korea, specifically in the Songdo region? And yes, that is all part of reverse student mobility, that even these institutions that are technically American or otherwise not Korean are also serving as sort of local, and I put local in square quotes because there's a lot we can discuss on whether it's American or Korean. They do contribute to reverse student mobility. A lot of the international branch campuses that were set up in Songdo, they started with very special financial agreements with the South Korean government where they were heavily subsidized for the first several years of operation until they can then operate independently from the South Korean government. So, there was actually, it's still very much a government-driven experiment, if you will, of bringing in these campuses to South Korea and offering yet another option of international education education at home.
Thank you. The next question comes from someone who has it's a two-parter. So the first part: has the decline in Korean students to the U.S. been offset by a potentially increased number of Koreans doing internships and work abroad in the U.S.? So are more Koreans coming to the U.S., just not necessarily doing university or education programs? And then the second question, to what degree are lower Korean student numbers in the U.S. representative of the same student groups going to China?
Okay. Could you repeat the second half of the question? I'm sorry.
Sure. To what degree are the lower number of Korean students in the U.S. Representing the same students going to China? So are they coming from the same pool of students? Are the people going to China, are they pulling away from the students going that would otherwise be going to the U.S., or are they coming from different subsets of the South Korean education system?
Okay. Gosh, so that is a tough question. Trying to think how to answer this. So the immediate answer is I think that's very, very hard to extrapolate. I mean, just even in my applied work, when we talk about admissions and we survey students and we ask, well, where would you have gone to if not here? And that's actually, that has to do with perceptions and lots of different things. And what you say is not always what the data might show. But, I'm not going to necessarily answer the second half of it, but I will say that for the first half of the question, I think it was a question about whether students are coming to the United States for internships instead of study abroad. It depends on the visa status. I also interpret that question of what are the numbers of F1 visa holders, which are the full-time students, versus J1, the scholar visas, and maybe that's what the internship visa is meant for. There's also, of course, as I mentioned in the talk, the OPT visa, which follows the F1 visa. An F1 visa holder who graduates from a degree program can then convert to an OPT status. So actually, in the United States, and this is overall, not just for South Korean students specifically, so new international student enrollment has been decreasing, but we have seen overall a growth in international students in U.S. higher education. And that's because actually there is a growth in the number of OPT visa holders. And that just goes to emphasize my point that it is such an important visa that the work experience in conjunction with the degree is so much part of what makes the United States a valuable opportunity, and it makes it attractive for an international student to come study in the United States.
Oof, I'm sorry, more tough questions coming your way, but you're doing a great job of handling them. We have a question from Margaret Luvano, who asks, what role do you think competition from other English-speaking countries who have focused on attracting international students to their universities plays in the decrease in Korean students choosing the United States?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And it's a commonly asked question in relation to the Trump effect question. So what role does the Trump effect have on international student mobility? And therefore, are other English-speaking countries more desirable places to study compared to the United States? And oftentimes Canada is used as a frequent example, but of course there are many others, the Commonwealth countries and the UK. I think for the issues that would pertain to a South Korean student about the the relative advantage of studying abroad relative to the affordability, the much more cost-conscious decision making that comes into play. These are all issues that will still be very much part of the conversation when a student is potentially thinking about an alternative English-speaking country compared to the United States. I think that one very real factor that may shift a preference from one country to another will be things like whether or not the OPT visa remains a viable option, whether there is the ability to work at least for a temporary period after pursuing a degree. And I know that in some of the quote unquote competitor English speaking countries that is a little bit easier. And so, yes, that certainly makes it more or less competitive.
Switching gears again to focus more on the U.S. on the South Korean side, Glenn Fukushima asks, does the South Korean government or industry see the declining South Korean student enrollment in the U.S. as a problem? If so, what is being done to reverse the decline, or is the number of South Korean students in China welcomed and encouraged by the South Korean government?
Well, I can't speak for the government, but I think we can look at it from the angle, one particular angle, and that particular angle is looking at why these internationalization reforms in the higher education sector were adopted in the first place. It was really for the intention to financially save, so to speak, higher education institutions in South Korea that were having domestic student shortfalls. And so, in that aspect, bringing in international students or perhaps retaining South Korean students who may otherwise study abroad, sure, there is perhaps a financial incentive to do so. Whether or not these policies were originally intended and designed in that way, that is at least one consequence to them, whether or not it was intentional.
Another question coming in says, what do you think about the potential potential future trends in virtual study abroad after COVID-19, especially for short-term language programs? Do you think this will start to be available online, or there's still an emphasis on the experience of being abroad to study?
Yeah, that is also an excellent question. I think we're all also grappling with the answer to that question as we sit here, each in our own living rooms or bedrooms and whatnot. There's at least a perception of virtual instruction that will be difficult to overcome in South Korea and actually in many other parts of the world. I think perhaps in our current moment with virtual instruction becoming more ubiquitous, maybe some of the stigmas we had around it have lessened. But nonetheless, I think that we're also just very much craving that face-to-face interaction, especially in this moment when it's more difficult to attain that. And so I don't think that virtual instruction will completely change the delivery of international education or study abroad. And in fact, I would even argue to say that part of what makes a study abroad intercultural experience so powerful is that experience of discomfort, that it's not just learning the content of your education, but also to fully experience the sense of immersion and discomfort that comes with that through your study abroad experience. I think it's a little bit harder to get that same sense of discomfort when we're all sitting at home in our living room. So in that sense, I think virtual instruction will not drastically change study abroad.
We're nearing the end of our time, and I just wanted to ask a little bit of a forward-looking question other than COVID-19. In your presentation and your paper, you talk about through 2019 the domestic internationalization efforts in the South Korean higher education system. But are there any that you know of moving forward? Or is this what we're up through 2019? Is that what we should expect moving forward, or there are going to be continued pushes to have more sweeping initiatives to internationalize the university system?
Right. So There are a few initiatives that have been proposed recently, and this also changes administration to administration too. But these days, in addition to internationalizing higher education, there's also a push to diversify South Korean higher education. Diversify used to mean by bringing in non-Korean nationals into South Korean institutional spaces, but I think now there's a bigger push to diversify along the lines of gender, for example, and there's actually a specific initiative that was proposed very recently to diversify the gender imbalance across the professoriate in South Korean higher education. So I think we'll see more of these kinds of initiatives.
Those sound really important, especially considering the broader imperatives for the Korean government to try and increase the number of women in the workforce and the education system. Is certainly one area where there's a lot of room for improvement. And so we have a few more minutes left. Do you have any parting thoughts? I have some housekeeping notes I'd like to bring up, but if you have any parting thoughts for our audience, I'm sure they would appreciate that.
Sure. Well, I just wanted to first say thank you so much for joining this talk this afternoon, for listening to my talk. And, I just want to emphasize that this is a very important bilateral relationship between the United States and South Korea. And it is very important that the United States still maintain its position as a very attractive destination for international students from South Korea and elsewhere for a number of different reasons. And so I hope also that the points I've made in this talk and in the paper are very much considered for those in the U.S. policymaking space.
And I would echo those concerns and those considerations. I really do hope people do appreciate how important this is. I think we kind of take it for granted, and it's something that it's always there, but it's not necessarily something that it's something that we have to actively work towards and adjust. And I think you've laid out some really great recommendations for U.S. policymakers to follow in order to keep the numbers of Korean students in the United States either at their levels or rising. I think it's a really important people-to-people connection that we have, and we should continue to maintain it as best we can. And we have a couple of other events coming up, and I just want to let everyone know next week on Thursday, October 29th from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. we have another academic paper series program, this time on South Korea energy and climate. It's called Bridging the Gap, LNG in South Korea's Energy Transition to Carbon Neutrality. Again, that time is Thursday, October 29th from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. And then next Friday, something I'm also really excited about, we have a conversation between KEI President, Ambassador Kathleen Stevens, and Ambassador Cho Hyun, the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea to the United Nations, talking about Korean diplomacy and the UN and all different types of topics. I know both Ambassador Stevens and Ambassador Cho are really excited to have this conversation. It will take place next Friday, October 30th, from 2 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. So with that, that wraps up our program. Thank you all for joining, and especially Dr. Kim, thank you again for your great presentation and adept handling of very difficult questions from the audience.
Anytime. Thank you, Kyle.